I don't give a f about you in the police house. Call the goddamn law.
Imagine being stuck in an abusive relationship for years, constantly fighting for your life, and when you finally muster up the courage to fight back, the system turns around and labels you a criminal and a murderer. Well, that's exactly what happened in this situation. A young black mother who faced an unimaginable amount of abuse found herself on trial for murder after a desperate act to protect herself. Good day, my good people. I am the Mysterious Black Bandit. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Before we get into this tragic video, y'all already know what to do. Hit that like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications so you don't miss out on any of these videos whenever I upload. And once you've done that, let's get into the story. I'm pretty sure we all have experienced a toxic and abusive relationship. I know I have. In most cases, we're able to get out and move on. But unfortunately, for some, just picking up and leaving isn't as easy without extreme measures. In 2010, in Stratford, Connecticut, 19-year-old Cherelle Baldwin was a young and independent woman who was working 2 full-time jobs on top of going to college to become a medical specialist administrator. Well, later on that year, while filling her tank up at a gas station, this young man named Jeffery Brown, who was at the other pump, walked over and introduced himself. After talking for a bit, they exchanged numbers and the rest is pretty much history. They instantly had a strong sense of attraction towards each other. Y'all know how new love is. They spent hours on the phone each and every day discussing their past and future goals. They talked about their likes, dislikes, and their hobbies. Of course, with all the talking, they were eager to spend time together, so it wasn't long before they began meeting up and going on dates every chance they got. Soon afterwards, Cherelle, who was living with her mother, Cynthia Long at the time, stopped coming home at night. Now, over the next few months, Cherelle had completely moved out of her mother's place and started staying with Jeffery completely. Now, it was kind of weird that Cherelle never brought Jeffery around the family, but that following year, she finally brought him to meet her mother, but by this time, she was 2 months pregnant. Now, at first, Cherelle and Jeffery seemed to have a good relationship going on and was even planning a future together, but some of the people in her family, particularly her mom, felt that something was kind of off. Jeffery seemed to be a very controlling person. Usually when you're around your mate's family, you try to put on your best behavior, but not Jeffery. While at family gatherings, in front of everyone, he would get up and say, "Let's go, Cherelle," like he was upset at something. And just like most battered women, Cherelle would immediately get up, pack her things, and they would leave. Per Cherelle's mother, she started behaving differently around them. Before she was with Jeffery, she always made her own decisions and pretty much held her own, but ever since they got together, any plan she had that didn't involve him, she had to check with him on everything she had to do that day, make sure she answered the phone anytime he called, and basically let him know every move she was going to make. Now, I agree that if you want to have a good relationship, you do need to communicate with your significant other on some things, but you shouldn't have to let them know every single move you're making. Now, weeks before the baby was born, Cherelle called and asked her mother if she could spend the night. While she was there, Cherelle, who was pretty much a peaceful sleeper, began fighting and crying in her sleep. Now, of course, as a mother, she suspected that something traumatic was going on in their relationship, so she asked Cherelle if she could recall what was happening in that dream. But Cherelle wasn't the type of person to put her business out to anyone and always kept quiet about problems she was having. So she just told her mother that it was nothing and just chopped it up to being pregnant. Now, after the baby was born, Cherelle kind of started getting back to normal. She would come over and visit, bringing the baby around the family without having to check in with Jeffery, but out of nowhere, she began pulling away from them. Everyone knows that once you have a family and child, your time is very restricted. But when she pulled away from that cousin she grew up with and was very close to, they knew that something wasn't right. Although they weren't seeing each other as often as they used to, one of the last times that she visited her cousin, she told her that some of the money she had saved up was missing, and there were times that Jeffrey would take her car keys so she wouldn't be able to leave to visit anyone. Now, on New Year's Day in 2012, Jeffery wanted to go out to celebrate, but left Cherelle and the child at home. Well, while he was out, he got into a car accident wrecking Cherelle's new car. When he got home, she asked what happened to him, and he instantly crashed out. He started yelling and screaming at her, grabbed her phone and tried to break it. Then, while she was holding their child, he walked over and began violently shaking her. Eventually, Cherelle goes into another room and calls her mother to tell her what happened, and this was basically the first time she had ever mentioned any abuse she was going through. So, of course, Mama was like, I'm on my way over there. Go ahead and call the police. But as soon as Mama was about to get in the car to head over, Cherelle called her back and told her that she didn't need to come because Jeffrey's mother was coming over. Now, despite her mother urging her to still call the police, she never did. But from that point on, Jeffrey unleashed a full demon. He took away her phone to prevent her from calling her relatives and friends. When she began working her new job at Yale's New Haven Hospital, Jeffrey, who was not working at the time, stayed at home to watch the baby, but throughout the day, this dude would call her repeatedly. At the time, they only had one car, so he would drop her off at work, take the baby to her mother's house, and would disappear throughout the day until the late morning, causing her to be late to work so much that she eventually lost her job. By 2013, Cherelle finally had enough of it and decided she was going to leave him. It seemed like he already had somebody on the side because he immediately moved in with another female. Now that their relationship was over and he had moved on, you would think that would be the end of the abuse, but that was indeed not the case. With them having a child together, it was pretty much impossible to cut off all contact from him. By February of 2013, Jeffrey had began terrorizing Cherelle. He would show up to her house unannounced, and sometimes he would toss her clothes out the house, and when she tried to call 911, he snatched her phone out of her hand and threw it on the ground, breaking it. Eventually, he was arrested and pled guilty to breach of peace, then was issued a restraining order, but this didn't stop nothing. Just a few days later, he showed up again and took off with their son. In order for Cherelle to get her son back, she had to drive down the wrong side of the road just to get him to stop. This man had Cherelle so traumatized that when she got off work from her new job, she would ask her cousin Latrice, who was watching her son throughout the day, to follow her home, which was only a few minutes away, just in case Jeffrey was stalking her. Then in May of 2013, he found out that Cherelle was at a local restaurant celebrating Mother's Day with her mom, so wanting to cause more havoc, he pops up outside the restaurant, calls her, demands that she brings their son outside, and if she didn't, he threatened that he was going to come inside the restaurant and act a fool. Now, although her family had already paid for everything, she came up with an excuse to leave and abruptly left with her son. Now, just 6 days later, on May 18th, 2013, Jeffrey started off early with his craziness. Around 6:49 a.m., he sent Cherelle a series of texts stating, "I said what I said, so you can take it however you want to. But after today, you won't have to call the cops because it's over." She responds and says, "Just leave me alone," but this was far from what he had planned to do. Not long after he had texted, "You will see how crazy stuff gets today," he shows up at her apartment and tries to get in the door, but when he wasn't able to, he climbed through her window and started attacking her. First, he pulled a knife on her and then grabbed a belt and started beating and choking her with it while their 19-month son was in the room. With Cherelle kicking and screaming, she finally managed to escape and ran outside and got in the car, but not far behind her was Jeffrey, who was able to get in the car with her and proceeded to choke her. She eventually was able to get her off of her and jumped out the car, but when she did, she tripped and the car ran over her leg. Now, once she seen that Jeffrey was getting out the car to attack her again, somehow she managed to get back in the car, hit the gas, crushing him against the apartment, which was 100 feet down the driveway. The impact of the crash pushed the wall back more than 10 inches. Now, as this was going on, Cherelle's father, who lived right above her, called the police. When they arrived, Jeffrey was pinned against the car and the wall, and Cherelle was lying next to the car, barely moving. The paramedics rushed over to Jeffrey and attempted to revive him several times, but they were unsuccessful. So they both were taken to a hospital, but separate ones. Jeffery was declared dead, and Cherelle was treated for a broken leg and questioned by the police. Now, for 3 weeks, the investigators went over all the evidence that was provided by Cherelle and the family, and basically came to the decision that nothing supported what she claimed happened. So a letter was sent to her by mail stating there's a warrant for her arrest, and she was to turn herself in immediately. Now, just a few days later, accompanied by her family, Cherelle turned herself in. During the initial hearing, the judge charged Cherelle with murder, stating that she intentionally accelerated her red Pontiac into her ex-boyfriend and set her bail at $1 million. 10% of that would have been $100,000, so her nor her family could afford that, and she was sent to the state's woman prison in York Correctional Institution to await her trial. Now, when this incident was first covered by the media, they described her as a crazed woman who crushed her lover to death in a savage attack without knowing the full story. By 2015, almost 2 years later, her trial finally began. The prosecution doubled down on their narrative that Cherelle had deliberately killed Jeffery, stating her story didn't match up with the evidence, plus her broken leg was most likely caused by her driving to that cement wall and not from the car running over her. Her defense team argued that she acted in self-defense, emphasizing all the trauma and abuse she had faced on a day-to-day basis. Just days before the May 18th incident, Jeffery had gotten a suspended sentence for ripping the cell phone out of Cherelle's hand following a fight they had had in their apartment, and they even had witnesses who said that they heard Cherelle screaming, "Help! He's trying to kill me." Now, of course, Jeffrey's family, who came to see justice be served for their son, felt that Cherelle was a cold-blooded murderer. They felt that she intentionally rammed him into that wall because she was jealous he was seeing another woman. Now, after 5 days of deliberating and listening to a tape-recorded testimony from Cherelle, 11 jurors felt that this was a domestic violence case and wanted to either consider lesser charges or acquit her altogether, but one juror held out. That one person caused the trial to end in a hung jury or mistrial, stating that the case was far from clear-cut and the evidence was largely circumstantial, so Cherelle was sent back to prison. Now, at first, the judge didn't have a plan to have another trial, but months after it was over, Cherelle's lawyer and her mother went back to at least try to get her bail lowered, but the judge refused to do it. It took months for them to even decide if she deserved to be retried or not. Cherelle's lawyer had to pretty much beg for a retrial. Now, from the beginning of this incident, Cherelle had spent nearly 3 years in prison and didn't know if she would ever get out, but with the help of domestic violence organizations, Cherelle was granted another trial. In the second trial, Cherelle pleaded not guilty to murder again, which carried a sentence of 25 to 60 years in prison in Connecticut. In this trial, they highlighted the troubles of domestic violence victims who commit violent acts to protect themselves from their abusers. During her testimony, she said that her ex was abusive, controlling, and stalked her in the days before the fatal incident. She told the jury that on that day, Jeffery had broken into her house, strangled her, and beat her with a belt in front of her young baby. She continued and said once she managed to get outside, all she was trying to do was get in the car and drive away, but as soon as she got in the car, he jumped in and started choking her again. So from that point, all she could think about was making sure she stayed alive for her child. This case had 38 domestic violence organizations from across the state called the state prosecutor to drop the charges on Cherelle, arguing that this case was a prime example of how Black domestic violence victims are disproportionately targeted by the criminal justice system when they try to protect themselves. The jury, which was comprised of 7 women and 5 men, deliberated for less than 2 full days in Cherelle's second trial and found her not guilty. Cherelle was finally set free after serving 3 years in prison, but while she was in there, all her bills, student loans, and credit cards went unpaid, so she was forced to file bankruptcy. This story isn't just about one woman's fight for survival. It's a window into a larger systematic problem. Every year, countless of domestic violence survivors are criminalized for defending themselves against their abusers. Understand that majority of the women who are incarcerated were victims of domestic violence or abuse before being in prison. And just to throw some statistics out there, domestic violence is more likely to be fatal for Black women. Although they are only 8% of the nation's population, my melanated sisters are twice as likely to be killed by an abusive spouse and 4 times more likely to be murdered by a boyfriend or girlfriend than a white woman. Now, there are a plethora of questions that need to be answered about this, but most importantly, why are domestic violence victims not believed in the first place? All across the country, we see many female victims talk about how oftentimes they're not taken seriously or perceived to be equally aggressive. To me, it seems like the legal system struggles to handle these cases because they either don't care or they just want to keep those prison cells full. I don't know, but y'all let me know what you think down in the comments below. All right, family, that will do it for now. If you haven't already, you already know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe, turn on those notifications. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, stay mysterious, my friend.